Hello, this is a discussion of the first part of Simone de Beauvoir's 1944 work, Pyrrhus and Cineas. This work, in many ways, could be understood as addressing the question, what is a viable philosophy of life? If you think about the trajectory of philosophy from its very beginning, there were always two tracks, complementary sometimes or divergent at other times. The first track is the goal of philosophy is to get things right, to come to a theoretical understanding of what is. The second track, equally old, has for philosophy the goal of finding a way to live, living a good human life, a fruitful human life, a satisfying or fulfilling human life. In our own times, in academic philosophy, the preference has been for the former approach to philosophy. Academic philosophy deals predominantly with theoretical approaches to the subjects that it wants to try to understand. But there's always been this counter practice of philosophy, a philosophy of a way of life. And in this essay of Beauvoir's from the middle of the last century, she's wrestling with possible answers to that kind of question of what advice, so to speak, can we have in order to try to live good lives. Think about the time in which she wrote this essay. Europe had torn itself apart not once but twice. Paris was only recently liberated. The Second World War was coming to an end. The atomic bomb had been exploded. The Holocaust had come to light. And people wanted answers. People believed that the traditional answers, particularly those from their religious and cultural past, weren't addressing how Europe, how they had come to such a pass. How did that happen? And who are we now? How do we live now? Now, if we fast forward to our own time, we have similar situations. It's not just because at the moment we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, but from the time of, say, 9/11 or the financial meltdown of 2008, even to now, there's upheaval. People are not finding the kinds of answers they need to address the question, how should we live? And just like in Beauvoir's time, there were those who offered alternatives to the traditional answers, and they looked for new ideas or maybe to reawaken some old ideas. And the same goes for us, that even though, especially in the younger age brackets, people are identifying as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not having any formal religious affiliation, still there's a hunger for answers to big, deep human existential questions. And that's why, in many respects, existentialism is having a comeback today, and some various alternatives that even Beauvoir was talking about her day, in particular stoicism, and in our times perhaps Buddhism and others, are coming to the fore again. So this is a very timely essay. She's trying to address these questions as well. And in the first half of this essay, she looks at some alternatives. So the first section of the first part she labels the instant, and the question is, what about this advice for living a fulfilled life? What about carpe diem? What about seize the day? What about living for the moment? Our problems, our turmoils, our anxieties are all a function of the fact that we're obsessing about the past, or we're worrying for a future, neither of which is here. Maybe the idea is to contract our being to the point and just try to live for the moment. And the goal for those who would give this kind of advice is to try to find a sort of rest, a kind of a stasis, or an existence that took no thought for what has gone before or for the morrow, and try to live in the moment. And Beauvoir's critique of Stoicism and Epicureanism, which we'll say more about in a moment, stems from this kind of idea of living in the moment. So a little background. Stoicism is a Roman philosophy, and alas, it doesn't get discussed as much as it probably ought in the traditional histories of Western philosophy. probably for the main reason that it is more of a philosophy of life rather than a strictly theoretical sort of philosophy. Some of the main proponents are the Spaniard Seneca, who lived in the time of Jesus, Epictetus, who lived, say, around the time of the Book of Acts, and St. Paul, and even the Emperor Marcus Aurelius was an intellectual and wrote books. And the writings of these thinkers are making quite a comeback today, and you can find websites and new publishing projects to bring back the ideas of the Stoics, who are giving us a philosophy of life advice for how to live. The roots of that school, of course, go back even further, before it even took on a name. It's a philosophy of life that's therapeutic. And again, academic philosophy these days tends to reject the idea of philosophy as therapeutic. They want to leave that to psychology or pop psychology or something else. But academic philosophy tends to go more towards the theoretical, and so downplays the therapeutic aspect. The gist of the therapy is the realization, they would tell us, the Stoics would tell us, that negative emotions are based on illusions. The reason we feel bad is because we're being bothered by things that in the end aren't really real, things that we don't need to be bothered by, and yet we are. So the therapy would be to try to learn what it is that we really should concern ourselves with, and let go of the things that produce the negative emotions, which don't have to. And their view would be that the sage, the person who attained this wisdom, would not experience negative emotions, at least the way Beauvoir tells us. They would think they just wouldn't experience them at all if they had their mind right, so to speak, if they were wise in the ways of living a human life in a fruitful way. For the Stoics, and this is a key point too, virtue would be sufficient for happiness. What does that mean? Virtue, living a life of excellence, on the Stoic view, would be living in such a way as not to be taken in by or fall for those illusions which cause the negative emotions. So if we were wise and living well with virtue, with excellence, we would be happy on this view. We would. Now, Aristotle, who in the Nicomachean Ethics gave us the central text on virtue ethics and how to live a life of excellence, said that moral virtues, living well, are extremely important. And he argued that a person who lived according to virtue would probably be more likely to have a happy life than one who did not. However, Aristotle did recognize the role of luck, bad luck. So he will speak about people who, even though they lived as well as they could with as much virtue as possible, they were good and kind and brave and generous and honest, still suffered tremendous bad luck with illnesses or political upheaval or war or accident. Things can happen, and Aristotle would say, you couldn't say about a person like that, even though he or she lived with perfect virtue, you couldn't call that person happy or fulfilled, and this, even in the rich sense that he means it, if they were constantly beset by this terrible bad luck. Aristotle argued that, in a sense, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do about what happens to you. And he does say that virtue can shine forth under terrible circumstances, but still he said it would just be a kind of a philosophical joke, so to speak, to call somebody who is immiserated by bad luck through no fault of their own a happy person. But for the Stoics, there's a sense in which that bad luck would be completely irrelevant, that misfortune cannot dictate our happiness in any way if we learn to be wise, if we're sagacious about it. Epicurus is another figure that Beauvoir talks about. He lived earlier on. The school of thought, if you want to call that Epicureanism, takes its name from him. He argued that pleasure is the only good. A modern day proponent of the exact same idea would be John Stuart Mill, one of the founding lights of utilitarianism. Mill, you may recall, argued that the only end worth pursuing is pleasure and the absence of pain. That is the only end that we pursue, ultimately, either directly or through some kind of mediation. And he would agree with Epicurus. The pleasure is really the only good when you get right down to it. Epicurus, though, said, if that's right, if pleasure is the only good, if you want to be happy, what you ought to do is be very conservative in your desires, be very narrow and even Spartan in what it is that you desire in terms of pleasures. Why? Because pleasures are fleeting, they come from the outside, and it's often likely that we will fail to attain the pleasures that we desire. So if we don't seek too many, if we seek the easily attainable, then the chances for us attaining this state of ataraxia in the Greek word, a state of tranquility, which he equates with a happy life, is by living modestly and limiting our desires. What's interesting and kind of ironic is today the term Epicurean means almost the exact opposite. We think the epicure is somebody who seeks pleasures with a great passion to the exclusion of all else, and that's a confusion of Epicureanism or Epicurus's ideas anyway with hedonism. He's not a hedonist, Epicurus. He's a person who counsels a certain kind of modesty in living as the best way to attain a kind of happiness. Well, what's Beauvoir's critique about that? There's certainly something to it, but she says you got to think about it a little bit. The assumption of the Stoics and the Epicureans is that my pleasures and pains are somehow other or separate from me. Like there's me over here, and then the pleasures and pains that kind of come from the outside, implying that I can kind of take them or leave them, so to speak. But she thinks that's not right. That's not the proper understanding of pleasures and pain. She says on page 96 of the essay, but in reality, enjoyment is not a given fixed in the narrow envelope of the instant. No, our enjoyment assumes my existence. You have to remember, for these philosophers, existence means more than just the fact that I am. But it's a technical term, meaning that I exist, that I literally stand out over against my situation. And I make decisions in terms of it and choices in the light of it. And it's another word for my freedom, so to speak. So enjoyment is a part of my project. And again, this word is a bit of a technical term. It's about our undertaking, about our being thrown forward towards goals that we set for ourselves. So in a sense, if you thought about it, pleasures and pains, enjoyments, would be ununderstandable in the absence of having such projects, such desires, such things that we want to do, that we must choose to do one thing rather than another. We have to make choices, we have to make decisions, and our pleasures and pains are inextricably tied to those projects. So if a human being were not a project, we would never experience pleasures or pains. We would never experience enjoyments or disappointments. So how could you separate off your enjoyments from you and say, well, I could take or leave my enjoyments? You can't. You are your project. You are those choices and decisions, and the enjoyments and the disappointments will come along with those. So there's no way really to escape those things. So this idea of ataraxia, she continues, this idea of trying to withdraw on yourself and to narrow yourself to the moment to find this sort of stasis or rest, she says basically good luck with that, because it's always going to be confronted by anxiety. This word that she's picking up out of Heidegger's Being in Time, the idea of angst, which is in a way kind of an objectless fear. It's not really fear, it's distinguished from fear, which always has an object, to a kind of confrontation with the ungroundedness of ourselves, with our being in the world, with our being whose being is a question for us, always, our being a being of possibilities, even more so than our what we've actualized. More importantly are our possibilities, but which possibilities and what will be possible? We learned all about that and how, according to Heidegger, we flee this anxiety and trying for ataraxia, this kind of tranquility or stasis. Beauvoir says is always going to be interrupted by this kind of sense that we need to push on. So she gives us sort of homey example here on page 97. In this way, the pouting child withdraws into a corner and says, "I don't care about anything." But as soon as he looks around, he fidgets. gets bored. And when life withdraws into itself, it is not peaceful ataraxia, but the anxiety of indifference that flees from itself, that tears itself away from itself, that appeals to the other. In a lot of ways, we have been withdrawn against our will, in fact, into our corners these days. With our shelter-at-home orders and our social distancing, we've been put alone with ourselves, and our projects have been interrupted, and we feel more anxiety than ever. And our common ways of dealing with our anxiety by keeping busy and having projects and keeping moving, we've been cut off from those, and we really don't feel stasis or rest now that we don't have to be bothering ourselves with all these projects we're in. No, it's just the opposite. Because we don't have those projects, we feel today a more acute sense of anxiety, like that kid. We're fidgety. We want to get moving, and we're frustrated and upset that we can't. Thinking about this just for a second, I brought this up with you before. This very famous book by Albert Camus, The Stranger. People read that who did not read a lot of the formal philosophy by some of these authors like Sartre and Beauvoir and even Camus. And they took this character of Meursault, the guy who just, is completely indifferent about life. It's just living with ennui, with, utter boredom. Nothing really matters. There's no meaning. Who cares? Even if you kill somebody, even if they execute me, who cares? That's a weird kind of tranquility that existentialists really don't understand. And yet so many people who read this it's a really good read, The Stranger, come away with it like Meursault is what existentialists teach us to be like, to just be bored with life and completely indifferent to things. That there may be part of that that's kind of like the Stoic, but it's nothing to do with the philosophy of action and engagement that you find with our existentialist thinkers. It's one of the ironies of intellectual history that a character like Meursault comes to seem like he represents what an existential life would be all about, when in fact it's the exact opposite. That's the absurdity, the monstrosity of Meursault, that he tries to live like that. We can't even make sense of it. He's a monster for that reason. Well, what about heaven? What about hoping for heaven? I like old bands. I really enjoy this band, the Talking Heads. I still do. And I've always really kind of loved this song, Heaven, which has a lyric in it. Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. And I, just speaking, for myself, I have to say that, the idea of heaven sounds very appealing after the hassles and struggles of this life. Wouldn't it be great to think that at the end, I can leave this veil of tears and somehow be in heaven? But I have to admit, I've as kind of nice as that sounds, kind of theoretically, I don't know what it means. I've always had a hard time understanding what it means. And they say, well, heaven, it's where there's no more sorrow, no more tears, no more struggles. You just get to enjoy God, face to face, praise God forever. And maybe I'm just being weird about it by trying to picture standing there every day going, I love you, God, I praise you, God. I'm not saying that heaven would not be absolute wonderful. I'm saying I can't understand what that wonderful is. And when I heard this song by the Talking Heads, I said, yeah, that's kind of what heaven would be. And I can't make sense of that. A place where nothing ever happens, a life where nothing ever happens. It has no meaning. And when I came to read this article by Beauvoir, I saw this passage of hers and I said, I think that's it. I think that helps me understand why I was having trouble understanding what heaven would be like. She says, it's because man, she means people. She even though she was a great feminist philosopher, all her writings and their translations do not use gender-neutral language, is because we human beings are transcendents, that it's so difficult for us ever to imagine any paradise. Paradise is rest. It is transcendence, which is what we are. We always transcend our actualities towards our possibilities. It's a place where transcendence is abolished, a state of things that is given and does not have to be surpassed. But then what shall we do there? In order for the air there to be breathable, it must leave room for actions and desires. We must have to surpass it in its turn. It must not be a paradise. The beauty of the promised land, the biblical promised land that we want to get to, the beauty of the promised land is that it promised new promises, that it was a place where new possibilities were going to open up. Immobile paradises promise us nothing but eternal ennui, boredom, eternal boredom. So what about this? Do we really want the end? In the sense of a goal, of a sense of an aim, but also in the sense of bringing things to an end? Do we really want that? It seems like if we are transcendence, if we are always surpassing, then maybe we say we want things, but we don't, and therefore things don't have meaning again. She writes on page 99, a man who desires and who lucidly starts an undertaking is sincere in his desires. He wants an end. He wants to attain his goal. He wants what he wants. He wants it maybe at the exclusion of any other end. I'm an Eagles fan. Everybody knows that. Back a couple years ago, I, like every other Eagles fan, wanted to win the Super Bowl. We wanted that more than anything else, to exclusion of all else. We set everything else aside, and we just wanted to get that Lombardi trophy. That's what we wanted. But she goes on to say, he doesn't want this end or goal in order to stop there, just to enjoy it. He wants it in order for it to be surpassed. Think about that. When we won the Super Bowl, it was minutes. I don't even think it was days. It was minutes until people started to say, how can we win the next one? When Coach Peterson says, I want to make this the new normal, he's already thinking about winning next year. Okay, we won. That's fantastic. Let's have a parade. Let's get excited. But the only thing we're talking about during the parade is how much we want to win that again. The notion of an end is ambiguous, since every end is a pointed departure at the same time. And I'm pretty sure Simone kind of had that in mind with their lyrics "Closing Time." If you were out ever, not that you should have been out when the bars close, you have probably heard that song "Closing Time." It has that great line: "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." That's exactly an existential point, and that Beauvoir would certainly agree with. In fact, she said it in so many words right above that. We want an end. We do. We want it very much. We want to graduate from school. We want to get that job. But we don't want them just to have those. We want them for what else they're going to be able to give us without end. So so the question is, all right, if it just keeps going on and on like that, is there really meaning? If I only want what I want in order to see what else I can get after I get that, does it ever really come to an end? She's going to think about that with us, right? But this idea that we want our goals to be fulfilled for the possibilities they open up to us is, she says, just another statement of the fact that we're freedom. We are transcendence and we are freedom. So what's the bottom line in this? Even those who preach indifference to others. That's their project. It's their choice. They're the ones who write Stoic books and say, you know what, you should let this all just roll off your back. Don't pay any attention to it. Don't fall for those pleasures and pains. They're busy with their project, trying to start their websites or republish these books or talk others into becoming Stoics like they are. I posted, for those of you who are in the class, I posted up for you an essay by Robert Lind, a not well-known English essayist, not well known to us anyway, called wonderfully "On Not Being a Philosopher." And as a philosopher and even a professional philosopher, I enjoy this piece very much. At the beginning of it, he says in effect that he would like to be wise, and somebody recommended that he read one of these Roman philosophers and that he would get some wisdom from that. So he said, I'm going to do that. I think I'll do that. And he goes through the whole thing, and he comes to the conclusion that he kind of agrees with him. He says, yet, though close as is the resemblance between our opinions, me and Epictetus, I could not help feeling as I read that Epictetus was wise in holding his opinions, and that I, though holding the same opinions, was far from wise. For indeed, though I held the same opinions for purposes of theory, I could not entertain them for a moment for purposes of conduct. He says, for instance, I'm supposed to let indignities and offenses just roll off me, not be bothered. Be like the stone. If somebody drops the stone or says mean things to the stone could care less. It doesn't care at all. It's perfectly content. He says, but when I go to a restaurant and then somebody brings me cold soup, and I can't, Epictetus said, well, I'd be happy if I just could accept anything that anybody brought me, but I wanted my hot soup. And it upsets me and it bothers me. So yeah, okay, right. He's right. I should just let that roll off. But I do not let that roll off. I don't know how to let that roll off. And he gives us at the very end a little piece of wisdom that probably I should post up before every philosophy course as a warning. He says to become wise without effort, by listening to a voice, by reading a book. It is at once the most exciting and the most soothing of dreams. In such a dream I took down Epictetus, and behold, it was only a dream. The idea is, and it's an idea that the existentialists would certainly agree with. Look, the idea is not to become an existentialist. It's not the idea is not to become a Beauvoirian or Sartrean or Heideggerian. The idea is not to let somebody else do your thinking and therefore you're living for you. The idea is to find a way to live for yourself. And there may be advice or guidance, inspiration even from various philosophers and artists and public people and other people in our lives. But it takes effort to live a life. You can't get it by osmosis. You can't get it passively. You have to get your wisdom by making your choices and living according to your own lights. All right. So what about a different strategy? She dismisses this idea that we can contract our lives so that things don't really bother us. She says that's not going to happen. What about the opposite? What about if instead of trying to reduce ourselves to a point, without standing outside of ourselves to try to stop that turmoil and reach tranquility, what if we did the opposite? What if we tried to expand our reach to infinity, as far as we can, to take in and take on the entire world? Can we, though, embrace the whole world? That's the question that she wants to ask here. In the first introductory section of this essay, she made a comment about the Chinese. She said, well, anybody could care about the Chinese, but I can't care about them. And by Chinese, she meant people on the other side of the world from her. She says, anybody can care about the Chinese, but I can't care about them, just on a whim. I have to have some connection to care about people. I certainly can care about people way over there, but there's got to be some kind of connection. It can't be some kind of abstract thing. And we mentioned, too, the passages from Adam Smith, where he talks the same about how we come to care about people, and he used China as well, on the other side of the world. And it's only because we can find some kind of interests of our own that connect us with those people who are far away from us. Okay, so you could look back in that earlier section, but the conclusion here for her is if we were trying to be everywhere, we would actually be nowhere. If we tried to hold every view, we would end up having no views whatsoever. She says in a kind of poignant passage, if all men are my brothers, then no particular man is my brother any longer. That claim may upset our tender sensibilities a little bit. We're many of us are taught that we should regard all human beings and all the world as their sisters and brothers. And there's something profound and beautiful about that as a goal. But Beauvoir has a keen eye, and she's asking, could you do that, even if that were your goal, even if that sounds like a very noble sentiment? Is there a way to do that in such a way that you're not dealing with abstractions, but dealing with flesh and blood human beings? That's always her concern. So the prior strategy meant kind of divorcing myself from the world and even from my own body, my own feelings of pleasure and pain, in some ways just setting myself against those. This strategy means trying to identify myself with the whole world, but it would require losing myself in the process. And I think at bottom, her critique of this strategy, this advice for living a life, is that you can't fully and finally, ultimately lose yourself in that way. It can't happen. So therefore, you can't merge. And look, we all know people who claim to love humanity but hate particular people. You may be one, I may be one. Like, oh, I love the idea of humanity, but that guy over there is really irritating to me. I think an example where you can see something like this is the Coen Brothers movie Barton Fink. I won't give too many spoilers away here, but the character Fink's played by John Turturro. He's a New York playwright, but he becomes very disaffected with the bourgeois theater, and it's just about superficial things and money. He wants to write plays for the working man, for the people. He wants it to be a revolutionary, meaningful thing, the theater. Okay, a great sentiment. But then he meets a working man, a kind of a working man played by John Goodman. And when he meets him, all Fink does is just pontificate about his lofty ideas about the people and the working man, and doesn't pay the slightest bit of attention to an actual flesh and blood working man right in front of him. He's involved with an abstraction, the people, or the working man. That's not somebody you run into on the street. You run into characters like John Goodman, although, not to give anything away, I hope you don't run into a character like John Goodman, not that working man. But that's the point. Fink, it's essential to the story here. Fink is in love with the working man, but not a working man who's in front of him. And this idea of abstractions is always very bothersome to Beauvoir and Sartre as well. We get caught up in abstractions and not in the flesh and blood existing human being, or as Kierkegaard would say, the poor existing individual. Now, I pause for an aside to talk about something that Beauvoir does not talk about, and that is Buddhism. But I think it's a good place to introduce another possible philosophy of life. Now, Buddhism is, again, a good example, I think, of the complement between the philosophical goal of getting things right and understanding the way things are, and philosophy as therapy to solve some of our problems. For the Buddha, the problem is always suffering. And suffering happens because of desire. And what we desire are things that are illusory. So we desire the permanence of ourself and the permanence of things. But the Buddha said that will always lead to suffering. That will always lead to disappointment because things are impermanent. That the self we get so worked up about and so defensive about is really a construction that could be deconstructed and reconstructed, to use a language Buddha didn't use. Or this idea of sunyata, emptiness, that things are devoid of an intrinsic existence that just make them are what they are. That those things are false. And so when we are disappointed because we want things to be permanent, we want us to be permanent, we want us to have a self that's settled and over and done with and completed, we suffer. So on the one hand, the for itself, which is Beauvoir and Sartre's term for Dasein. Heidegger used the word Dasein to talk about you and me. Sartre and Beauvoir used the term the for itself as opposed to the in itself. And the in itself would be something like being present to hand for Heidegger, things that are not human. The for itself, the human, has no intrinsic existence. Is a kind of emptiness. In other words, it's a freedom, it's a transcendence. It is always outside of itself. Or as Sartre likes to say in several places in Being and Nothingness, a human being is what it is not and is not what it is. It is what it is not and is not what it is. It's not what it is, it's not only what it is, and it is what it might be, but isn't at the moment. It is its possibilities. So there is no settled self, and therefore we should not be spending as much time defending this thing that is just an abstraction or a chimera of some sort. But this is interesting. So even though there's this parallel, Beauvoir seems to reject the project of attaining enlightenment as the Buddhists understand that, because we can't be a no self, right? Nor can we be as empty one with everything. We are a self. We're a self in process, we're a self at work, but we're very real, not a chimera, not a hallucination. It's real, the selves that we are, the for itself that we are, very real. but it's a real in the sense of a no thing. It's not a thing. It's not an in itself. But so we're not empty, and we can't, as she would understand it, be one with everything. Myself is abolished in the universal, but it's impossible for me to identify the universal, since it's I am the one who's asserting this this merging. You can't ever finally merge into everything else, because consciousness always is an existence. It's a standing back from everything. So even though we're being in the world, there's still a Dasein that's being in the world. Even though we are frequently they-selves, as Heidegger would say, we're still our version of that they-self, and will always be taking a stance towards that they-self. So Beauvoir would reject the Stoics, as she would reject at least the advice of the Buddhists for having a well-lived human life as well. Well, that brings us closer to the question of God. So another strategy might be to merge our will with the will of God. We're as I talk through this, we're coming up on the Christian Holy Week and Good Friday, where the Good Friday celebration is in fact a reflection on the prayer of Jesus. Let this cup pass from me. I don't want to go through this, but I really don't want this to happen to me. What looks like it's going to happen to me, but then Jesus prays, well, but not my will, but thy will be done, Father. Let me merge my will with yours. That's the way to be. And the Christian teaching is that we all ought to be like that we should try to merge our wills and what we want with the will of God. And the goal there would be, in some sense, to give a grounding or a foundation for the things that we do will. Without merging our will with the will of God, our will is willy-nilly. Our will is seems to be grounded in nothing. So in order to settle us down and to get us going in the right direction, we try to merge our will with the will of God. And Sartre, it's interesting, in Being in Nothingness, he has a big discussion where he tries to describe human beings as a desire to be God. And just if you're reading the essay, she really sets up this discussion at the end of the prior section that we're discussing now, the section on God. All right, what about this? So Beauvoir says, this is what we're doing. We're trying to give closure or justification of our acts by tying them to the absolute will of God. There's the absolute, no longer relative, no longer blowing with the wind. God will provide the finality, the closure of our lives. But she says this can't work. She says it can't work. Why? Because it's always a matter of interpretation. It's always a matter of hermeneutics, all the way down. When we say, if I say, I want to merge my will with the will of God, I have already made a choice. I've already made an interpretation that there is a God and that I can understand what God's will is clearly enough to figure out how it is that I'm supposed to make my will and God's will as one. But the foundation is not God's will, Beauvoir points out. The foundation, but it's not even really a foundation, a kind of a groundless ground, is that I choose to interpret my life, my world, my reality in this way. I make a choice. I make a leap, as Kierkegaard would say, to choose to interpret the world as being created by God, a good God who loves us all, and that makes his will known to us such that I can merge my will with his. But I'm the one choosing that. I'm the bottom line here. Now, I raise a question that's not raised by Beauvoir, but I think it's an interesting question just to kind of ponder. Would the recognition of the inescapability of interpretation, would that require us in intellectual honesty to adopt atheism? Would it require that of us if we were going to be intellectually honest. If we say, look, this belief in God you have, your religious life, your commitments like that, that's all a matter of interpretation. And because it's all a matter of interpretation, you can't prove it. You can't prove God's existence. You can't prove that you understood the will of God, or that really even is the will of God, not just your version of the will of God. So that means it doesn't really mean anything, and that means if we're just going to be honest, we should just give up the idea of God. We should give up the idea of religious life. And I think on first blush, the tendency, when I ask students this, usually the first answer that comes back is, if it's really true, if it's interpretation all the way down, so to speak, then I guess you'd have to say atheism is the intellectually honest position to adopt. I mean, that you would have to just say it, because it's just a mere interpretation. However, my 2 cents worth on this, I do not think that it requires atheism. I do not. Because again, kind of following Nietzsche, if we've abolished the real world and are left only with the apparent world, only with our interpretations, then the apparent world we shouldn't use the word apparent anymore. Whatever's left, what's left is interpretation. What that is our world. That is our reality. That is what's important to us. That's what's meaningful to us. There may be no cosmic or metaphysical backup or foundation or justification for the choices we make for how we want to live our lives, but the choice of how we live is fundamental and fundamentally important to all of us. So the choice, the leap to a religious life is as legitimate in a cosmic level or a metaphysical level as the choice, and it would be a choice, it would be an interpretation, of atheism. They say, well, does that mean anything goes? That I could just pick whatever I want? Well, my short answer is no, and my wise guy proof is just say, well, go ahead, try it. Just try to believe anything, whatever. You'll find that it's really hard to do. The choices, interpretations that we make in life are very hard won. If we choose to think about things in terms of the modern physics and science, it took a long time for some of us to get to that interpretation. We find that's the best, most life-giving interpretation. Other people have maybe taken a very long time, a very thoughtful time, to come to the views of a religious life, of sources and powers that even though we can't understand them or talk about them, that we have a sense of them and they drive our life and they are meaningful and they're important. We can't just believe any old thing. You can't just flip from one thing to another. I mean, people do, but it's almost like you don't even need to give them the time of the day because it's unserious. But if you want to live a serious life, you are forced to make choices. You're forced to make determinations without the backup, the metaphysical kind of backup. And Beauvoir will give us a way to think about this. Now, I reference this, so I don't want to pass over too quickly, but Sartre has a certain logic here where he says what human beings are is a desire to be God. And he's an atheist, and he's not saying that humans desire to be all-powerful or omniscient or omnipotent. Doesn't mean that. Here's his logic. He says, fundamentally, man is the desire to be. Fundamentally, we are the desire to be. We want to keep being. I mean, with everything that's going on in the world, I think every day, many times a day, I would like to keep being. I desire to be. And that is what the for itself, what Dasein is. That's what you and I are, a desire to be. Okay, that sounds pretty good, right? It's just an ontological observation. We all desire to be. That's how we're built. It's the kind of thing that we are. The for itself, again, that's me and you, is the being which is to itself its own lack of being. Heidegger would say Dasein is the being whose being is a question for it. Sartre paraphrases that by saying the for itself is the being which is to itself its own lack of being. We are not settled. We don't just are. We're in a kind of becoming state. This means the for itself emerges as the annihilation of the in itself. What does that mean? Well, we in a way, we are not an in itself. We're not just a thing. We're not just an over and done with, tied up with a neat bow thing. We aren't. So a for itself is always undoing the bow, undoing the neat package, always looking for the next possibility, for the next thing, for transcending, for being our freedom. So it's a annihilation. It's a turning whatever the thing we think it is that we are into not being what we are. We are what we are not, and we are not what we are. The in itself, this I am a professor. That sounds like I've said it. That's what I am. But me, the for itself, the being that I am, always is saying, yeah, but no. I am. It's true. I don't want to be in denial. I'm a professor, but that's not what I am. I'm my possibilities, and the same would go for you. Thus, I'm not a something desperately. Excuse me. Let me say that again. Thus, I am a not something. Right. Not an is what it is. I am a not something, desperately trying to be something, but never being the something that I nevertheless am. How can you just be possibilities? You can't, right? Because what are you doing? What am I doing? What is everybody doing all the time? Actualizing certain possibilities, but not others. Even if you say, you know what, I'm going to sit still and actualize no possibilities, you've just actualized one possibility among others, which thereby opens up new possibilities for you. So you can't just be. You can't just come to stasis. You can never just come to a stop. But I want to be something. Everybody wants to be something. Everybody wants to be a somebody. Everybody does. So what could this in itself, for itself be? Or I might say, what is the for itself in itself, or for itself as such? What are we? What does that make us? The answer, if I could just be limitless possibility, I would be God. I would be a kind of an omni. That's what I want. I want to be the thing that I am, but I never get to settle into the thing that I am, because the thing that I am keeps pushing me to make decisions, to make choices, to act, to choose, to decide. Right? But if I just wanted to be the being of the for itself, the being of Dasein, I would be limitless possibility, limited by nothing, infinite. I would be the infinite being. I would be God. So Sartre says, if this is ontological, if this is what we are, this weird, somewhat frustrating kind of being, a useless passion, he sometimes calls us, it explains, Sartre thinks, why there are so many religions in the world. So here's what he says in Being and Nothingness. If man possesses a pre-ontological comprehension of the being of God, right, before human beings do any kind of deep study of God, we just sort of have an idea of God. All humans seem to do that. It's not the great wonders of nature. In other words, people think, why is there religion? Well, because there's thunder and lightning and we don't know what to make of that, so we posit some kind of power that does that. Sartre says, nope, that's not why. Nor the power of society, which we have conferred upon him. Like, well, people came up with the idea of God to keep other people down, to keep them in line. God is a cosmic cop. Sartre says, nope, that's not it either. Why, wherever you go in the world, you find some kind of innate idea of God. He says, God, value, and supreme end of transcendence, remember transcendence is what we are, represents the permanent limit in terms of which man makes known to himself what he is. To be man means to reach toward being God, or if you prefer, man fundamentally is the desire to be God. It's part of our makeup, and we just project out into the world a kind of fantastic entity that is a reflection of the kind of being we are. There is God because we are a for itself. We are transcendence. We are freedom. At least says Sartre. That's his argument. A couple points also about God along these lines. The great French philosopher Voltaire said, in the beginning, God created man in his own image, and man has been trying to repay the favor ever since. All right, maybe there's a God. God created us, but we're always trying to make out God what we want God to be. We want to be on our side, not on the bad guy's side. All that kind of stuff. That's Beauvoir again. It's a decision. It's an interpretation. God is for us. Xenophanes, to go way back to the pre-Socratic times in Greek culture, wrote the following. The Ethiopians say their gods are snub-nosed and black. The Thracians, that their gods, have light blue eyes and red hair. But if cattle and horses or lions had hands, or were able to draw with their hands, horses would draw the forms of the god like horses, and cattle like cattle, and they would make their bodies such as they each had themselves. Cultural relativism. We decide that God is like us. God is a projection of us, and in some ways that's what Sartre's saying as well. God is a projection of us. Says him, and says Voltaire, also an atheist, says them. All right, but you should understand what their point of view is, that there's a universal sense that goes under the label God. Something very important and serious and profound is going on under the label God. The mistake that these thinkers would say is to think of that as some entity, some super entity, some supreme being that happens to have those characteristics. What's going on under the label of God is going on, and that's important. And it doesn't lead, as I argued earlier, to a commitment to atheism, at least not the kind that people think of as atheism, which is just a question of is there such a supreme being or is there not such a supreme being? But it's not necessarily a rejection of a deeply religious life. But that's a discussion, I guess, for another day. All right, so last idea here is, well, what about humanity? We're still looking for the absolute. We're still looking for a way to ground or found our own existence. We haven't found it, according to Beauvoir, so far. What about in humanity? And she asks this question, is it enough that future generations live on? Like, if I live and conduct my life, not for what I get out of it, but for what my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, what they get out of it. A lot of people, a lot of parents, a lot of grandparents, like myself, have a tendency to kind of think like that. We want to, do what we do so that future generations can live on. Those of us who are concerned about our economy and our environment, our natural world, probably have these ideas. And she's wondering whether that would do it, like live for future generations. Maybe that's the philosophy of life. Maybe that's the best advice. And she said, would that be enough to give an absolute value to my acts or to my life? Would it give my life a built-in set meaning? And Aristotle, he warned us against thinking about an infinity of ends. We got to have some kind of ends, right? He says in the Nicomachean Ethics, suppose then that the things achievable by action have some end that we wish for because of itself, and because of which we wish for other things, and that we do not choose everything because of something else. Again. For if we do, he says, it will go on without limit, so that desire will prove empty and futile. Aristotle thinks if we don't have a final cause, a telos, which for him is happiness, and happiness has a content for him, it's a real thing, if we didn't understand that, we wouldn't understand any of the intermediate desires that we have in our life. Nothing would ever make any sense. Life would be absurd. Beauvoir says this on page 112 of this essay. If one claims that every end can be seen as a means toward an end that is farther off, one denies that anything is really an end. The project is emptied of all of its contents, and the world crumbles by losing all form. Man finds himself plunged into the heart of an expanse of equal indifference, where things are what they are without him ever choosing to make them be. I think if you read that passage in a certain light, I see her as agreeing with Aristotle, that if it's really just an infinity of one thing after the next, after the next, after the next, after the next, things would just sort of lose all value, meaning. Everything would become indifferent in the great expanses of time. Many people have seen existentialism, particularly Sartre, and this may be one of the places where Beauvoir and Sartre are not of one mind, see Sartre as disagreeing with Aristotle. He would agree with this passage that I just read to you. Sartre would. That's right. If it's just one thing after next without limit, life would be empty and futile. And Sartre says, and guess what? It is empty and futile. Man is a useless passion. We're a desire that'll never be satisfied. It's just one thing after another, so life is absurd. Those are all words that Sartre uses. but Aristotle says, oh, life is not absurd because there is an end that we choose for its own sake alone and not for the sake of anything else. There's no after that. If I asked you, why do you want to be happy? You would probably say, I don't know. I just do. Aristotle thinks that's proof that he's right and Sartre's wrong. That there's a thing that we want that's the ground of all the other things that we want. Our final cause, our telos. Beauvoir seems to be agreeing with Aristotle too, that life would be empty if it was just one thing after another after another. The question is, does Beauvoir think then that life is absurd, like Sartre always liked to write, that life would be completely devoid of meaning, like it seems Sartre says from time to time? And I want to say that I don't think that she does think of us as a useless passion in the same way that Sartre does. I think they do disagree on this. Now, on a good reading of Sartre, though, maybe they do agree. There's an ontological point to be made here. Neither of Beauvoir or Sartre are Meursault, where life is really absurd. Sartre didn't sit around in boredom. Beauvoir certainly did not sit around in boredom. Not there. They cared a lot. They did a lot. They were committed a lot, and they even paid prices for that commitment. Sartre's saying really something about the ontology of us, the way we're built, the structural nature of what it means to be human. When he says that man is a useless passion, he's talking about the fact that there is no external grounding for the passions that we have. There's no cosmic or metaphysical basis or justification that shows us these are the things that we should be concerned about. These are the things that we should be passionate about. We're passionate about them, but there's no ontological backdrop for that. But Beauvoir puts it this way: usefulness is nothing that you could talk about when you're doing ontology. I could also say meaning, in a sense, is nothing that you could really talk about in a concrete sense when you're talking about ontology, how we're built. Here's Beauvoir from her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity. The word useful has not yet received a meaning on the level of description where being and nothingness, that book, is situated. In other words, she's saying Sartre's not talking about usefulness in that book. That book's on ontology, so it doesn't have anything to say about usefulness. Usefulness can be defined only in the human world established by man's projects and the ends or goals he sets up. In the original helplessness from which a person surges up, nothing is useful, nothing is useless. It must therefore be understood that the passion to which man has acquiesced finds no external justification, no outside appeal, no objective necessity permits of it being called useful. It has no reason to will itself. But this does not mean that it cannot justify itself, that it cannot give itself reasons for being that it does not have. Right? It doesn't have the choices, the projects, the endeavors that we involve in. They don't have a meaning. They don't have a usefulness in some kind of in itself kind of sense. We give our lives, our projects, our choices, our decisions. We give them the reasons. We make meaning. We don't find it, we make it. I like to ask whether you're interested in finding yourself. People say I'd love to find myself. I'm just trying to find myself. Going to college to find myself. I'm going to do some traveling to find myself. As if yourself is up there somewhere, out there somewhere, waiting for you to show up. Standing around, tapping its toe, going, where you been? I've been waiting here for years. No, you don't find yourself on the existential view. You make yourself. You determine yourself and your choices and actions. You don't come with a pre-built-in meaning, and your life does not have a pre-built-in usefulness. Religious theologians, religious philosophers, theologians may object to this view, to say that there's an inherent dignity to all human beings. I'm not sure that Sartre and Beauvoir would disagree with that, but it sounds like maybe they are disagreeing. I'm not sure they would, but I think it sounds like they might be disagreeing. because they just don't like the idea of ontologically built-in meaning and purposes. They just don't think there's any way to find that it's all a matter of interpretation. But if it's all a matter of interpretation, then our interpretations matter. That the reasons we make, the people we make ourselves into by our choices and actions, that's all we got. That means they are supremely important, supremely meaningful. So can you really live for humanity? Can you? Well, you'd have to be a passivity. You'd have to let the world sort of drag you along. It's got this idea of, that you have some kind of place in humanity, but Beauvoir says we're de trop. We're superfluous. We're not a place filler at all. There's no real reason for us to be here, but here we are. And she likes to say, there's not a place out there waiting for you. You got to make your place. And she says also something that may, offend our sensibilities. She says, in serving some, you work against others. She says that in numerous places in her philosophical work, and she illustrates that in some of her literary works. That's a key theme. In serving some, you work against others. If you work for the poor in Latin America, you're working against the wealthy oppressors of Latin America, and you may as well expect that you'll get a great deal of pushback. There's no way she thinks that everybody will be able to fully get along. And if she's right about that, maybe it's illusory to try to develop some kind of programs that would somehow pretend that we all could. It would mean we'd have to rethink what we're doing in our lives and our policies and our choices. If we're always going to be working against some people, then I guess we got to decide what side we're on, as the old labor movement song says. Got to decide what side you're on, and I think Beauvoir and Sartre would certainly agree with that idea. Wouldn't history make this whole thing work out? Aren't we just in the middle of progress? Aren't we evolving into something higher? Aren't we along for the ride? She says, humanity is a discontinuous succession of free people who are irretrievably isolated by their subjectivity. So an action thrown into the world is not propagated infinitely like the wave in classical physics. I do something because I want history to make it all valuable and meaningful in the long run, even after I'm long gone. She says, no, it may peter out and have no further connection to the rest of history. A friend of mine very tragically lost his wife young, and he was bitterly sad. It was terrible, and he said, he was reflecting. He says, in 10 years, people will remember her, and in 20, maybe people will still remember. But after that, like 30 years, probably no one will be around left to even remember who she was. That was a very sad thought, but I don't know, possibly realistic. I know I was lucky enough to meet my grandparents and even a great-grandparent, but I don't know my great-great-grandparents. I don't even know their names. I don't even know where they lived. I just don't. And they're my family. They were the parents of my great-grandparents and so on. So is this really an idea that we can hook into, that if we live for humanity in the future and history will take care of it? Can we really buy into that? Her point is that my action is for the other only what the other makes of it. So if I write a book, let's say, and nobody reads it, my action didn't have meaning in history, and history is not going to make it all work out. That's the end. The other had no interest in the book or whatever my project was. So does it make sense to say I want to live for that? She also talks about the irony of history, which I think is something worth remembering. Alfred Nobel, this guy invented dynamite, and it's the guy we named the Nobel Prize after. Nobel thought he was working for science. He was working for war. Epicurus did not anticipate what would later be called Epicureanism, right? As we just said, it's the exact opposite. Nietzsche would probably not recognize Nietzscheanism, and Christ would not recognize the Inquisition. Things done in their name. That's almost like the exact opposite in every case. Because that's what free for itself, free Dasein have done with those ideas. So she says one never really arrives anywhere. There are only points of departure. With each man, humanity makes a fresh start. And that maybe, especially today, could be an uplifting thought in a way. With each one of us, history is not determined how it's going to go for us, even in the midst of the crisis that we're all in right now. Each one of us is a fresh start on what it's all going to be about, what it's all going to be come to mean. And it's going to come to mean what it does through our choices and actions. And it's never been more important to choose and decide well. Remember, every new beginning comes from some other's beginning's end. The last section of this first part of the essay, Pyrrhus and Cineas, she entitled Situation. I just want to make a couple quick points about it. Here she talks a little bit about death and finitude and shows that she has some differences of opinion with Heidegger. So I recommend you take a look at the essay, pages 113 to 114, to note these differences. Beauvoir says, my death is not. Weird way of putting it is, well, you can die, but I can't. I mean, there's no such thing as me plus dead. Being for itself is being alive, being a consciousness, being a transcendence, being a freedom. So there's no such thing really as a dead for itself. That's a contradiction in terms. Sartre would say death is not a possibility of mine at all, but you remember Heidegger said death is my own most possibility. It's the one possibility that only I could ever actualize, and I will actualize it. And he says that's at the source of our anxiety. That's why he describes us as being towards death, because death for him, my own most possibility, the possibility of no more possibilities, the possibility of the impossibility of Dasein, which is always in each case mine, that's the backdrop against which our life has meaning and makes sense. But Sartre's saying it's not my own most possibility. It's not a possibility at all of mine. It's not one of my possibilities in the sense that he means it. He says in Being in Nothingness, the perpetual appearance of chance at the heart of my projects cannot be apprehended as my possibility, but on the contrary, as the annihilation of all my possibilities. Right? One of my projects is to try to teach this class, but maybe I get to COVID-19, maybe it really hits me hard, and it interrupts my project, but it kills me. That's not one of my possibilities. It interrupts my possibilities. It's the annihilation of my possibilities. Annihilation which itself is no longer a part of my possibilities. Thus, death is not my possibility of no longer realizing a presence in the world, but rather an always possible annihilation of my possibilities, which is outside of my possibilities. It's not something I need to come to grips with in the same way that Heidegger seems to think we should. Beauvoir says we should not say that I'm a being towards death. Heidegger, she says on page 114, has no right to say that this being, the for itself, is precisely for death. The fact of being is gratuitous. One is for nothing, or like for no good reason. Or rather, the word for makes no sense here. Being is a project because it posits an end, says Heidegger. But as being posits no end, just is. We just are. The project alone is what defines its being as being for. So I'm not being for death, I'm being for teaching, I'm being for grandpaing, I'm being for being a husband. That's what my being is for, not being for death. So they have I think a much more at least a much different interpretation of the role of death in human existence. For Heidegger, it's at the core of where meaning comes from, and we talked about why he thinks that. For Sartre and Beauvoir, they seem to be of one mind about this. It's almost something which we need to pay no mind because it's not one of our possibilities. Our possibilities are to have our projects and to have our commitments and to jump in with both feet. And that's the difference. So maybe it's worth pondering which, if either, of those two interpretations makes more sense to you. Now, just to finish up, on this thought is, Heidegger says our anxiety, our coming face to face with our being towards death, is something that it makes us feel uncanny, makes us feel angst. Right? We don't feel good. We don't feel at home. So we flee. We run back into the comforting, warm arms of the they. We run into busyness or maybe substance abuse or whatever. We run into denial. Beauvoir says, when I love, when I desire, I flee nothing. I'm not fleeing anything. I'm loving. I'm desiring. She doesn't think there's a under the hood kind of cause, so to speak, of why I love or desire. That's who I am. That's what I am. It's not a coping mechanism, as Heidegger would make it seem sometimes. I'm a they self as a coping mechanism to deal with anxiety. Beauvoir and Sartre have that turned inside out, that our lives, our loves, our desires are what we are. That's the flowering of the freedom and transcendence of our being for itself. All right, another distinction worth keeping in mind, which if either of those makes more sense to you. So to wind up section 1, then, Pyrrhus was right. And she says, therefore, Candide's garden can be neither reduced to an atom or merged with the universe. Man is only by choosing himself. If he refuses to choose, he annihilates himself. The paradox of the human condition is that every end can be surpassed, and yet the project defines the ends as an end. In order to surpass an end, it must first have been projected as something that is not to be surpassed. I need to win that Super Bowl, and that's it. That's the goal. Nothing could ever be better than that. It's the only way you could put it. Man has no other way of existing than looking at it like that. But we have to surpass it. It is Pyrrhus, not Cineas, who is right. Pyrrhus leaves in order to conquer. Let him conquer then. After that, he'll see. We want to conquer. We want to attain our goals. And after that, we'll see. All right, that's the end of the first section, and we'll talk about the second division in another lecture.